Rich man forces black waitress to play piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. The dimly lit interior of Emerson's piano bar shimmered with a timeless charm, its vintage chandeliers casting soft golden hues over polished oak tables. Set in the bustling heart of Charleston, South Carolina, the establishment was a melting pot of locals, tourists, and affluent out-of-towners who thrived on exclusivity and flair. The bar's centerpiece was a grand Steinway piano, its ebony finish gleaming like a crown jewel. Positioned prominently near the stage for Alana Brooks, this wasn't just a piano bar, it was a battlefield. At 28, she had spent the better part of a decade juggling waitressing shifts to support her younger brother, Trevor, through college. Life hadn't been kind to her, and the soft twang in her voice hinted at her southern roots, mingling with the resolve of someone who had weathered too many storms. Her mornings were devoted to practice sessions at an old community church, honing her skills on an out-of-tune piano. Music, to her, was both escape and salvation. Alana's love for piano came from her late mother, a talented musician who used to fill their modest home with melodies of hope. But now, as she balanced trays and dodged impatient hands snapping for attention, Alana rarely had time to let her fingers dance over the keys. The piano bar was a cruel irony, a place where her dream loomed in sight but felt impossibly out of reach. That Friday evening, the bar was packed. The usual patrons filled their corners, their laughter blending with the chatter and clinking glasses. Among them was Wallace Greystone, a man whose reputation preceded him. Wealthy, brash, and unapologetically arrogant, Wallace was a frequent guest who loved the attention his presence commanded. His tailored navy suit screamed opulence, and his booming voice overpowered any nearby conversation. Alana had served him before. She'd learned to dodge his probing remarks and biting sarcasm. But tonight, Wallace was in rare form, surrounded by a posse of sycophants eager to laugh at his every word. "Darlin'," Wallace drawled, waving Alana over with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Another round for the table. And for heaven's sake, smile while you do it. You're prettier when you smile." Alana's jaw tightened. She forced a polite nod, jotting down the order, and turned on her heel. Hey, not so fast," Wallace called after her. "Aren't you gonna play us something? I hear this bar keeps a piano for a reason." The comment hung in the air, drawing attention from nearby tables. Alana froze mid-step, her heart pounding. I'm just a waitress, sir," she replied evenly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Well, that's a shame," Wallace said, his tone oozing condescension. "I bet you'd give us all a good laugh. Bet you don't even know how to play." The laughter that followed was cruel, cutting through Alana like a knife. Heat rose to her cheeks, but she kept walking, her grip tightening on her notepad. By the time she returned with their drinks, Wallace had grown louder, his taunts escalating. "You know, it's funny how some folks pretend they've got talent, but never dare to prove it. What's wrong, sweetheart? Scared we'll see the truth." "Mr. Greystone, please," Alana said softly, setting the glasses on the table. "Oh, I insist," he said, grinning wickedly. "Let's make it interesting. You play, and if you don't embarrass yourself, I'll tip you $100. How's that for motivation?" The offer sent murmurs rippling through the bar. Alana hesitated, her fists clenched by her sides. The crowd was watching, their curiosity feeding off Wallace's arrogance. "It's just a little fun," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "What's the harm?" Alana's eyes flicked to the piano. The polished keys seemed to beckon her, reminding her of a time when music was her sanctuary, not a weapon wielded against her. She wanted to walk away, to let the moment pass. But something in her stirred, a quiet defiance born of years of being underestimated. "All right," she said, her voice steady but low. "If it'll make you stop talking, I'll play." The room erupted in applause, some genuine, others mocking. Alana's steps toward the piano felt heavy, each one weighted by doubt and dread. She sat down on the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. The whispers grew louder. "She's stalling. Bet she doesn't know a single chord. This'll be good." But as Alana took a deep breath, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Play from your heart, baby. That's all that matters." Her hands descended onto the keys, and the first notes filled the room. The melody was soft and haunting, an old jazz standard her mother used to play. The room fell silent, the chatter dissolving into an almost reverent stillness. Wallace's smirk faltered. The notes poured out of her like a confession, raw, powerful, and achingly beautiful. Alana lost herself in the music, her eyes closing as her fingers moved with practiced ease. The song swelled, reaching a crescendo that left the room breathless. When the final chord faded, there was no applause, no mocking laughter, just stunned silence. Wallace's expression had shifted from smug amusement to disbelief. "Well," he said finally, forcing a laugh, "I guess even a broken clock's right twice a day." Alana stood, her composure unshaken. "Hope you enjoyed the show," she said, her gaze locking with his. As she walked away, the bar erupted into applause. Not for Wallace, but for her. But Alana knew this wasn't over. Wallace had lit a fire within her, and for the first time in years, she felt ready to let it burn. The atmosphere in Emerson's piano bar crackled with a new kind of energy in the days that followed. Word of Alana's impromptu performance had spread like wildfire through Charleston, drawing in curious crowds eager to see if the waitress with a golden touch would play again. But Alana, despite the attention, kept her head down. She didn't want to give Wallace or anyone else the satisfaction of thinking they had unlocked something she wasn't ready to share. The moment at the piano had felt vulnerable, too close to a wound she'd kept hidden for years. Yet, she couldn't ignore the change it brought. Regular patrons now tipped her with a knowing smile or whispered encouragement. The old man in the corner booth, who rarely spoke, had even left a handwritten note on his receipt. "You have a gift. Don't waste it." But the moment wasn't entirely hers to savor. Wallace Greystone wasn't the kind of man to let a public bruising go unanswered. IT began subtly, a missed shift on the schedule, a sudden influx of complaints about her service. One evening, as Alana balanced a tray of cocktails, she overheard the manager, Mr. Franklin, speaking in hushed tones with Wallace in the corner of the bar. The exchange was brief, but Wallace's smug glance in her direction was enough to chill her blood. "Alana, can I speak with you for a moment?" Mr. Franklin called out later that night. She followed him to the back office, where the air felt stifling. Mr. Franklin, a wiry man with a perpetually anxious demeanor, adjusted his tie as he avoided her gaze. "There have been concerns raised about your attitude towards certain customers," he began, his tone clipped. "Concerns?" Alana echoed, her stomach tightening. "From who?" "That's not important," he said quickly. "What matters is maintaining a professional demeanor at all times. This is a high-class establishment, and we can't afford incidents." Alana felt her frustration rising. "With all due respect, Mr. Franklin, I've been nothing but professional." "If this is about Wallace Greystone," "Alana," he interrupted, raising a hand. "I'm not taking sides here, but he's an important patron, and we have to keep him happy." It was clear what this was. Wallace had found another way to wield his influence, turning her workplace into a new kind of battleground. That night, as she walked home, Alana's thoughts churned. She'd spent her whole life swallowing her pride, bending herself to fit the expectations of others. But this felt different. The memory of the applause, the validation of her talent, was a stark contrast to the humiliation Wallace was trying to impose. The next morning, she found herself outside St. Cecilia's Church, where she often practiced on their weathered piano. The sound of her playing had always been her sanctuary, but today it felt like a call to arms. Her brother, Trevor, met her there later in the afternoon. Fresh out of college and full of optimism, he was her rock, the one person who believed in her unconditionally. "Alana, you've got to stop letting people like him get to you," Trevor said as he watched her fingers glide over the keys. "That's easy for you to say," she replied, not looking up. "You're not the one being singled out." "I get it," he said gently. "But you've got something he'll never have, real talent. You can't let him silence you." She paused, the notes fading into the musty air of the church. "You think I should play again?" Trevor leaned against the piano, his smile warm and encouraging. "I think you should show him and everyone else exactly who you are." The next week brought another challenge. Wallace had rented the bar for a private event, inviting Charleston's elite for what he called an evening of elegance. The staff was abuzz, preparing for the lavish affair, and Alana felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She knew this was another trap, another opportunity for Wallace to humiliate her. The night arrived, and the bar was transformed into a scene from a Gatsby novel. Guests in tuxedos and glittering gowns mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Alana moved through the crowd, her tray balanced with precision, her expression neutral. As the evening wore on, Wallace made his move. Standing near the piano, he clinked his glass to draw attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice dripping with feigned charm, "we're in for a treat tonight. Our very own Alana has agreed to grace us with her musical talent. Isn't that right, darling?" Every pair of eyes turned to her. Alana froze, the room spinning around her. She started, but Wallace cut her off. "Oh, don't be shy," he said, his grin wolfish. "It's what you're good at, isn't it? Entertaining people." The laughter that followed was hollow, cruel. Alana's hands tightened around the edges of her tray, the humiliation washing over her. But then something shifted. The faces in the crowd blurred, their judgment fading into insignificance. "Fine," she said, her voice steady and clear. She set down her tray and walked to the piano. The murmurs grew louder as she took her seat, but Alana didn't let them deter her. She closed her eyes, drawing strength from Trevor's words, from her mother's memory, from the fire Wallace had ignited within her. Her fingers moved over the keys, and the music erupted. A piece so powerful, so intricate, it silenced the room. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. The melody shifted, morphing into something unfamiliar, something uniquely hers. Alana's emotions poured out through the music: anger, pain, defiance, and finally, triumph. By the time the final notes echoed into silence, the room was spellbound. Wallace stood frozen, his smirk long gone, replaced by an expression of disbelief. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous, a standing ovation that left no doubt about where the room's loyalty lay. As Alana rose from the piano, her gaze locked with Wallace's. This wasn't over, but she knew she had won this battle. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful, untouchable. And Wallace would soon learn that he had underestimated her resolve. The following days were a whirlwind of unexpected change. Alana's performance at Wallace's event had become the talk of the town, spreading beyond the confines of Emerson's piano bar and into Charleston's wider community. The story of a waitress silencing a room of elites with her unmatched talent had struck a chord. A local journalist, Bethany Carter, approached Alana during one of her shifts. Bethany was sharp and empathetic, her notepad always at the ready. "You've got a story worth telling," she said, her voice brimming with sincerity. "Let me write about you, your music, your journey. People need to know who you are." Alana hesitated. The idea of putting herself in the spotlight felt both thrilling and terrifying. But Trevor, ever her champion, urged her to say yes. "This could be your chance, Alana," he said over dinner one night. "People are already listening. Let them hear your voice." The article, published a week later, painted Alana as a symbol of resilience and raw talent, a hidden gem discovered in the unlikeliest of places. It caught the attention of local musicians, patrons of the arts, and even a talent scout for the Charleston Music Festival. An invitation soon followed. Alana was asked to audition for a slot in the festival's upcoming showcase. The news brought a surge of excitement and anxiety. The festival was a prestigious event, attended by industry leaders and music aficionados. It could open doors Alana had only dreamed of, but Wallace Greystone wasn't about to let her rise unchallenged. The public humiliation he'd endured at his event had tarnished his ego, and he was determined to reclaim his dominance. One evening, as Alana prepared to leave her shift, Wallace appeared outside the bar, leaning against his car. His demeanor was cold, calculated. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone devoid of its usual mockery. "A word?" Alana's instincts screamed to keep walking, but she stopped, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want, Mr. Greystone?" He smiled thinly, his eyes narrowing. Let's cut to the chase. I've got connections, resources. I could make your life very difficult or very easy. It's your choice. Alana stiffened. Are you threatening me? Not at all, he said smoothly. I'm offering you an opportunity. Forget this festival nonsense and go back to being the waitress everyone expects you to be. In return, I'll ensure you don't face complications in the future. Her anger flared, hot and unrelenting. You're scared, she said, her voice low but firm. You see that people are finally seeing through you, and it terrifies you. Wallace's expression darkened, his facade cracking. Careful, Miss Brooks. You don't want to make an enemy out of me. I think I already have, she replied, turning on her heel and walking away. The encounter rattled her, but it also solidified her resolve. Wallace's intimidation only fueled her determination to succeed. The day of the audition arrived, and Alana found herself backstage at the Grand Charleston Music Hall. The sheer scale of the venue, with its ornate architecture and soaring ceilings, was overwhelming. The other musicians, polished and poised, eyed her with curiosity and skepticism. Trevor accompanied her, his presence a calming force. You've got this, he said, squeezing her shoulder. Play like you did that night at the bar. Play like it's just you and the piano. When her name was called, Alana stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her momentarily. The judges sat in a shadowed row, their expressions unreadable. The silence was deafening. She took her seat at the piano, her fingers trembling slightly as they rested on the keys. But as she began to play, the world around her faded. The piece she chose was an original composition, a haunting, soulful melody that told her story without words. The notes ebbed and flowed, carrying the weight of her struggles, her dreams, and her defiance. By the time the final chord resonated, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged with awe. The head judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, leaned forward. Miss Brooks, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. That was extraordinary. Where have you been hiding? The audience erupted into applause, and Alana felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time, she believed she belonged. But Wallace wasn't done. That evening, as she celebrated with Trevor, she received an anonymous text message. Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts. It won't shine on you for long. Her joy turned to unease. It was clear Wallace had no intention of letting her go unchallenged. The following days were marked by subtle sabotage, anonymous complaints about her conduct at the bar, whispers that she'd fabricated her talent to gain sympathy. The pressure mounted, but Alana refused to back down. Trevor began digging into Wallace's past, determined to find something that could neutralize his influence. What he uncovered was shocking. A string of lawsuits, settlements, and buried scandals that painted Wallace as a manipulative, unethical businessman. You've got leverage, Trevor said, handing her a folder of documents. Use it. Alana hesitated. Confronting Wallace with this information felt dangerous, but she knew it might be the only way to protect herself and her future. The next confrontation came unexpectedly, during a public charity event where both Alana and Wallace were present. She approached him, the folder tucked under her arm. We need to talk, she said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. Wallace smirked, but his eyes betrayed his unease. This should be good. Handing him the folder, Alana said, You've spent your life trying to control people, but your time's up. I won't let you destroy me, and I won't stay silent. As he flipped through the documents, his expression shifted from amusement to panic. Where did you get this? He demanded. Doesn't matter, she replied. What matters is what I'll do with it if you don't back off. The tables had turned, and Wallace knew it. His threats, his influence, his arrogance, it all crumbled under the weight of the truth Alana now held. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. And it was a victory sweeter than she could have imagined. Alana left the charity event feeling a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. Wallace Greystone, a man who had spent his life wielding power with impunity, had finally been cornered. She had confronted him, and for the first time, the balance of power shifted in her favor. But she knew this was only the beginning. Wallace wasn't the type to retreat quietly, and though she had leverage, Alana understood that using it recklessly could backfire. She needed to tread carefully, especially as the Charleston Music Festival loomed closer. The event was her golden opportunity, a chance to cement her place as a legitimate artist. In the days leading up to the festival, Alana threw herself into preparation. The piece she'd chosen to perform was an ambitious original composition, one that reflected her journey, the pain, the hope, and the determination that had shaped her. Trevor stood by her side, offering unwavering support. "You're going to blow them away," he said one evening as she practiced. "I hope so," Alana replied, her fingers dancing across the keys. "But part of me is still waiting for the other shoe to drop." Trevor frowned. "Wallace." She nodded. "I don't trust him to let this go. Not after what I showed him." "You've got the truth on your side," Trevor reminded her. "And you've got talent. He can't take either of those away." But Wallace was nothing if not resourceful. The day before the festival, Alana received an unsettling phone call from her manager at Emerson's piano bar. "Alana," Mr. Franklin began hesitantly, "I don't know how to say this, but we're going to have to let you go." "What?" Alana's voice rose in disbelief. "Why?" "There've been complaints," he said vaguely. "It's out of my hands." She knew immediately who was behind it. Wallace's influence had reached into her livelihood, cutting off the income she relied on to make ends meet. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You know I've done nothing wrong." "I'm sorry," Mr. Franklin said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Best of luck, Alana." She hung up, her hands shaking. Trevor found her sitting at the piano, staring at the keys, tears threatening to spill. "He got me fired," she said flatly. Trevor's face darkened. "This guy doesn't know when to quit. What are we going to do?" Alana straightened, her resolve hardening. "We're not going to let him win. I've worked too hard for this." The next day, the Charleston Music Festival was abuzz with energy. Musicians from across the region gathered at the sprawling outdoor venue, their performances echoing through the air. Alana arrived early, her heart pounding with anticipation and nerves. As she waited backstage, her thoughts swirled with doubt and determination. Wallace might have taken her job, but he hadn't taken her music. And when the announcer called her name, she stepped onto the stage with her head held high. The audience fell silent as she took her seat at the grand piano. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the crowd, and the weight of their expectations pressed down on her. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but they grew in strength and complexity, weaving a tapestry of sound that commanded attention. The piece was a reflection of her journey, filled with unexpected turns and emotional depth. It swelled with power, dipped into moments of aching vulnerability, and built to a triumphant crescendo that left the audience breathless. When the final note hung in the air, a moment of stunned silence followed before the crowd erupted into applause. Alana stood, her chest heaving, and took a bow. The applause felt like a validation of everything she had fought for. As she stepped off the stage, a man in a sharp suit approached her. He introduced himself as Richard Hayes, a talent manager who had represented several prominent musicians. "Miss Brooks," he said, his smile warm. "That was extraordinary. I'd like to discuss representing you if you're interested." Alana's heart soared. This was the break she had dreamed of, and it felt like the universe was finally aligning in her favor. But Wallace wasn't finished. Later that evening, as the festival's after-party unfolded, he cornered her near the refreshments table. "Enjoy your little moment," he sneered. "But don't think I've forgotten what you did." Alana didn't flinch. "And don't think I'm afraid of you anymore," she replied. Wallace smirked, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "You've made a powerful enemy, Alana. Watch your back." Her voice was calm but firm. "You've made your threats. Now leave me alone, or I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." For the first time, Wallace seemed unsure of himself. He gave her a final, icy glare before walking away. Trevor joined her moments later, a proud smile on his face. "You handled that like a pro." "I'm done letting him control my life," Alana said, her voice steady. "He can't touch me anymore." Over the next few weeks, things began to change. With Richard Hayes as her manager, Alana started booking gigs at prestigious venues. Her name became synonymous with raw talent and resilience, a rising star in Charleston's music scene. Wallace's attempts to undermine her dwindled as his influence waned. The truth about his past began to surface, thanks to Trevor's relentless efforts to expose him. His carefully constructed empire of power and manipulation started to crumble, and Alana found herself finally free of his shadow. Through it all, she remained grounded, her music a constant reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd risen. The fire Wallace had ignited within her had become a beacon, guiding her toward a future she never thought possible, and as she sat at her piano late one evening, composing her next piece, she smiled. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger, her voice unshaken, her heart unbroken. The Charleston Music Festival had catapulted Alana into the spotlight, but her success was only the beginning. Wallace Greystone's threat still loomed in her mind, and she knew that as long as he held power, he wouldn't stop trying to tear her down. What Wallace didn't count on was Alana's determination to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone he had trampled on his way to the top. Trevor's investigation into Wallace's past continued, uncovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond Alana's personal experience. The folder he had initially handed her was just the tip of the iceberg. As more damning evidence came to light, it became clear that Wallace's empire was built on intimidation, deceit, and exploitation. "This isn't just about you anymore," Trevor told Alana one evening as they pored over the documents. "Wallace has hurt a lot of people. If we do this right, we can bring him down for good." Alana nodded, her jaw set. "Let's do it." With the help of Bethany Carter, the journalist who had written about Alana's rise, they crafted a comprehensive exposé. The article detailed Wallace's abuses of power, the lives he had destroyed, and the trail of evidence that proved his guilt. "This is going to make waves," Bethany said as she finished the draft. "Are you ready for the fallout?" Alana took a deep breath. "I've been ready for a long time." The article was published on the front page of the Charleston Gazette, accompanied by a viral video of Alana sharing her story. In the video, she spoke not as a victim but as a survivor, calling out Wallace's actions and urging others to stand up to injustice. The reaction was explosive. The public was outraged, and more victims of Wallace's schemes came forward, their voices amplifying the story. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched, and Wallace's reputation was shredded. But Wallace didn't go down without a fight. He attempted to spin the narrative, painting himself as the victim of a smear campaign. His lawyers sent threatening letters to Alana and Bethany, but the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. One evening, as Alana prepared for a performance at a packed concert hall, she received a call from Trevor. "Turn on the news," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. She grabbed the remote and flipped to the local station. The headline scrawled across the screen made her heart race. "Wallace Greystone indicted on multiple charges of fraud and corruption." The footage showed Wallace being escorted out of his office in handcuffs, his face a mixture of rage and humiliation. Alana felt a wave of relief wash over her. The man who had tried to destroy her was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Later that night, as she stepped onto the stage, the audience greeted her with thunderous applause. She sat at the piano, her heart full of gratitude and resolve. The piece she performed was a new composition, a triumphant, defiant melody that captured the essence of her journey. As her fingers danced across the keys, she thought about the people who had supported her, the battles she had fought, and the strength she had discovered within herself. When the final note rang out, the audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. Alana stood and took a deep bow, tears glistening in her eyes. In that moment, she knew she had not only reclaimed her life, but had also inspired others to fight for their own justice. Wallace's downfall marked the beginning of a new chapter for Alana. She continued to rise in the music world, her story serving as a beacon of hope and resilience. And while the scars of her battle remained, they were a testament to her strength, a reminder that even in the face of the darkest adversities, she had chosen to fight, to rise, and to shine. In the weeks following Wallace Greystone's indictment, the ripple effects of his downfall spread far and wide. Charleston's high society, once complicit in turning a blind eye to his misdeeds, found itself in the midst of a reckoning. For Alana, life began to settle into a new rhythm, one that wasn't dictated by fear or survival, but by hope and possibility. The public's reaction to her story had been overwhelmingly positive. She received letters and messages from people all over the country who were inspired by her courage, and many who shared their own struggles against oppression and injustice. "This is bigger than just music," Trevor told her one evening as they sorted through the stack of correspondence. "You've given people a reason to believe that change is possible." Alana smiled, but her mind was already racing with ideas. Wallace's downfall wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. With the help of her new manager, Richard Hayes, Alana launched a foundation dedicated to empowering underprivileged musicians. The initiative provided scholarships, mentorships, and access to resources for talented individuals who, like Alana, had been overlooked or underestimated. "I want to make sure no one else has to fight as hard as I did just to be heard," she said at the foundation's launch event, her voice steady and resolute. The foundation quickly gained traction, attracting support from prominent figures in the arts and entertainment world. Alana's story had not only elevated her career, but also created a platform for change. Meanwhile, Wallace's legal battles dragged on, each court appearance chipping away at his carefully crafted image. His wealth and influence dwindled as lawsuits piled up, and his former allies distanced themselves. One day, while practicing in her newly rented studio space, Alana received an unexpected visitor. Bethany Carter, the journalist who had played a crucial role in exposing Wallace, walked in with a warm smile and a familiar folder in her hands. "I thought you'd want to see this," Bethany said, handing it to Alana. Inside was a letter from Wallace himself. The handwriting was shaky, the tone uncharacteristically subdued. "Miss Brooks, I write to you not as the man you exposed, but as someone who has been forced to confront his failures. You may never forgive me, nor should you, but I wanted you to know that your strength has made me question everything I once believed. I hope you continue to rise, unencumbered by the likes of me. Wallace Greystone." Alana stared at the letter, a storm of emotions swirling within her. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a small step toward accountability, however late it had come. "Do you believe him?" Bethany asked. Alana folded the letter and set it aside. "I don't know, but it doesn't change what I've built or what I plan to do next." Bethany nodded, her respect for Alana evident. "That's why people look up to you. You never let anyone define your worth." Months turned into years, and Alana's star continued to rise. She performed at renowned venues across the world, her compositions celebrated for their depth and emotion. Her foundation grew, touching the lives of countless young musicians who saw her as a beacon of hope. Trevor, now her business partner and closest confidant, remained by her side through every triumph and challenge. Their bond, forged in the fires of adversity, became an unshakable source of strength. One evening, after a sold-out concert at Carnegie Hall, Alana sat in her dressing room, reflecting on the journey that had brought her there. The applause from the audience still echoed in her ears, a testament to the power of perseverance and authenticity. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Trevor poked his head in. "Ready to go celebrate?" Alana grinned. "Absolutely." As they stepped out into the crisp night air, surrounded by friends and supporters, Alana felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had faced her demons, reclaimed her narrative, and built a future that honored her passion and principles. The scars Wallace had left were still there, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as a reminder of her resilience, a symbol of the strength she had found in herself and the community that had rallied around her. And as she looked up at the city lights, a single thought filled her heart. This is just the beginning. Years had passed since Alana Brooks first stepped into the spotlight, her music captivating audiences and her story inspiring a movement. The city of Charleston had changed, and so had she. What once felt like a place of struggle had transformed into a canvas of possibility. where Alana's dreams had not only been realized but had blossomed into something much greater. Her foundation, aptly named Keys to Change, had become a cornerstone of the community, fostering a generation of musicians who might never have had the chance to pursue their passions. The annual benefit concert she hosted drew talent and supporters from all over the world, turning Charleston into a hub for music and philanthropy. At one such benefit, a young girl approached Alana, her eyes wide with awe. "Miss Brooks," she began nervously, clutching a well-worn sheet of music, "I just wanted to say thank you. Because of your scholarship, I get to take piano lessons now. And one day, I want to play like you." Alana knelt to meet her gaze, her heart swelling with pride. "You already have something even more important than talent," she said with a warm smile. "You have heart, and that's what makes music truly beautiful." The girl beamed, clutching the sheet music tightly as if it were a treasure. Alana stood and glanced around the room, filled with people who had come together to celebrate the transformative power of art. Among them was Trevor, who had become an integral part of the foundation's operations, as well as her closest friend. "You keep making magic happen," he said, handing her a glass of champagne. She laughed lightly, clinking her glass against his. "We make it happen. Together." Though Wallace Greystone's shadow had long since faded, its lessons remained etched in her memory. His downfall had sparked a wave of accountability in Charleston's elite circles, and the changes that followed were tangible. Alana had used her platform to advocate for ethical practices and social equity, ensuring her voice resonated far beyond the music world. Meanwhile, Wallace's name was rarely spoken, his empire dismantled, his influence reduced to a cautionary tale. Rumors swirled that he lived in quiet isolation, far from the grandeur he once reveled in. For Alana, his absence felt like the closing of a painful chapter, one that no longer defined her. On a breezy summer evening, Alana found herself walking along the cobblestone streets of downtown Charleston. The city was alive with music, the strains of a violin drifting from a street performer nearby. She paused, her fingers tingling with the urge to play. The performer noticed her and grinned. "You're Alana Brooks, aren't you? Want to join me?" With a playful shrug, she approached the piano he had set up. The small crowd that had gathered grew in size as her fingers found the keys, weaving a melody that seemed to echo the rhythm of the city itself. When the song ended, applause erupted, and Alana stood, laughing at the joy of the moment. As the crowd dispersed, she noticed a familiar face lingering at the edge of the square. It was Bethany Carter, now a celebrated journalist who had won awards for her investigative reporting. "Still stealing the show, I see," Bethany said, her smile warm. "Just sharing the spotlight," Alana replied. Bethany nodded toward the piano. "That's what makes you different, you know. You've always been about more than just the music." Later that night, Alana returned home to the modest but beautiful house she had bought on the outskirts of town. Her piano sat by the window, overlooking a garden that Trevor had helped her plant. She sat at the bench, her fingers brushing the keys as memories flooded back, of the hardships, the triumphs, and everything in between. She began to play, the notes flowing effortlessly, telling a story of resilience, redemption, and renewal. As the final chord lingered in the air, Alana closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She was no longer the girl who had been mocked and underestimated, nor was she defined by the battles she had fought. She was an artist, a mentor, and a survivor, a woman who had turned pain into power and found beauty in the struggle. And as the night deepened, her music carried on, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who dare to rise, no matter how many times they've been pushed down.